All right, we're going to talk about my first story of the night, which relates to my ongoing investigation into Bethany Christian Services and the ongoing look at adoption and industry in general. Now, I've talked about this recently, that there seems to be many people who, I think, unfortunately, mistakenly buy into the idea that the adoption industry is everything that we have been told it is, that it is just the best, that if you're taking children from drug addict parents and giving them to families who can't have children and everybody's happy on both ends, or a parent who just for whatever reason decides to give up their child, they make that choice consciously of their own volition with no manipulation, and then they give up their child and they're able to, keep in touch with the child as the child is raised by other people and everybody's happy. Yes, those situations do exist. They do happen. I won't deny that. But by and large, what I'm finding, what my research has shown, especially if you've followed my 2 previous articles and video breakdowns and my interview with Catherine Joyce, author of the book, The Child Catchers, is that this is not always the case. And in fact, it might be rare to say that adoption works out for the positive, and that in fact, most of the time, there is coercion, there is elements of lying, of fraudulent behavior, and as I mentioned earlier, potentially of trafficking children. So we're going to get into that. Let's go ahead and dive into this latest article. This one is, again, at thelastamericanvagabond.com. I titled it, Meet the Organizations Exposing the Truth About Adoption and Supporting Families in Need. And now the reason this one, as I might have mentioned to you last week, this article is a bit more focused on, yes, we're going to talk about the problems because we have to address the problems. But what's exciting to me about this, because we want to talk about solutions when there's an opportunity, is that I was able to speak to 2 different women who are involved in the organization Saving Our Sisters, and another one called the Adoption, Truth, and Transparency Worldwide Information Network. I think I got that right. We'll find out in just a second. And both of them shared their stories, again, of being involved, dealing with the adoption industry. One as a parent who relinquished their rights and then later regretted it. The other one as an adoptee who later in life found out that their parents were lied to about their adoption and has since now gone on to help other people. So I always love when we can talk about solutions, because that's what we need more than anything. Mothers who have been mistreated by Bethany Christian Services and similar adoption firms are now organizing on social media and founding nonprofits to provide crucial education and support for parents considering adoption. As I mentioned, I talked to the author of the book, The Child Catchers, Rescue, Trafficking, and the New Gospel of Adoption. Her name is Catherine Joyce. She told me that she thinks the roots of the current problems with organizations like Bethany Christian Services can be traced back to World War II. And when she talked to me recently, she said that this period in U.S. history is known as the baby scoop era following World War II. She said, quote, "This was an era of deeply secretive adoptions that usually resulted after women were sent away for some portion of their pregnancy to reside in a secretive maternity home where they were treated as though they had done something sinful. When they eventually had their babies were whisked away to adoptive homes, and they were sent home and told, 'You will forget this ever happened.'" And she says in these cases, some women would move on with their lives and they would have children later when they were married. And of course, post World War II, this sort of thing was extremely frowned upon. And so women were shamed. They were get out of here. Don't, you're a family secret. And then you'll come back when, from vacation without a baby. Catherine continues, "What happened instead is that so many of these women, and we're talking about millions of women in the US, had really profound, lifelong, extreme grief from the severing of the bond under what in many, many cases was at least coercive circumstances, and in some case, you could say outright forced circumstances. These women did not have a real choice about whether they were going to keep their baby." And so this is this baby scoop era where organizations like Bethany Christian Services were created and founded and start to come onto the scene. And as I previously reported, Bethany Christian Services, they have a history of support from the DeVos family, from the Trump administration, including former Secretary of Education under Donald Trump, Betsy DeVos. And this itself is emblematic of a larger issue, which I've since learned about, involving wealthy Christian philanthropists who donate to Bethany Christian Services and similar firms in the hopes that they will prevent abortions by promoting adoption. And again, I've tried to address this very delicately because I know some of you might have a reflexive response of like, well, adoption's better than abortion in all cases across the board, so I'm going to just support that regardless, because that is very much what this is being promoted as. You even got Supreme Court justices writing opinions and discussing the potential for adoptions to increase as they restrict abortion in many different ways. But unfortunately, my friends, an adoptee being adopted instead of being aborted does not guarantee them necessarily a better life and better quality of life. Bethany Christian Services also has a history of involvement in the U.S. government's separating of children under the Trump and Biden administrations. And I also reported on the history of lawsuits against Bethany Christian Services and how they've been accused by, parents have been accused of accusing Bethany Christian Services employees of lying to them or manipulating them in order to secure their adoptions. And in my second report, I actually spoke to 4 different families. 3 of them went on the record. Mothers who had direct experience with Bethany Christian Services and who felt that their lives were irreparably damaged and their relationships with their children as well. And each of them have different details about how old they are, what part of the country they came from, their backgrounds, but the outcomes are pretty much all identical. What the women told me was that they were promised what's known as an open adoption from Bethany Christian Services, and they chose to relinquish their rights for different reasons, but they said, okay, there'll be an open adoption, you'll get pictures of the child, you'll get letters, you'll get updates on their lives, you'll be a part of their life. But every single parent that I spoke to for my investigation said that those promises were not upheld and often were just completely ignored, or they were just outright lied to. And then as I ended my second piece, leading to where we're now, what we're about to cover, I discovered that there just like there is a quote unquote conspiracy culture on the internet that many of us are a part of. You could say truthers, conspiracy realists, whatever you want to say. There is a very similar thing when it comes to adoption. I'm calling it the adoption truth. And this is social media accounts, websites, organizations like we're about to cover with Saving Our Sisters and the Adoption Truth Network, who are specifically focused on trying to expose these topics and get more people to be aware of the actual nature of adoption. And as I'm going to show you, and as I've reported already, many of these cases I think qualify as trafficking of children, but they have this veil of morality or people kind of falsely believing that there's something they're not because of all the positive stories that we've heard about adoption and what most of us are led to believe about it. But let's continue now looking at the organizations who are involved in and really trying to help and support families who are dealing with this unfortunate situations. Let's go ahead and check this one out real quick. So Saving Our Sisters, this is the first organization we're going to look at. Renee Gellin, she's one of the co-founders of the organization, and she told me she had been struggling to get out of debt in 2008, after her business collapsed, and she found out she was unexpectedly pregnant. And she panicked. She struggled, she said, to believe in herself and her ability to give her child the best possible life. And after spending months trying to work out a plan and to take care of her incoming child, she ultimately signed papers to relinquish her parental rights 72 hours after her son was born. And she said that, like the other women, she was promised an open adoption. She told me, quote, "It was a very, very rude awakening and extremely traumatic to learn all the things that happen in an infant adoption. I was not informed of my rights. I didn't have an attorney. I didn't know I should have an attorney. It's been a really rough road, and it really affected my family." And after dealing with the aftermath of this, she started to go to the internet like many of us do. She started joining forums and checking out, looking for other people who had similar experiences or had just somebody to connect with. And that is exactly what she found. She started finding blogs about parents and others who had dealt with similar situations, similar experiences. And she connected to a woman named Lisa Woolsey, who was another mother who was also struggling with the adoption of her daughter. And the two women realized that they had both been misled regarding what they consider, quote, unnecessary infant adoptions. And they decided that they wanted to help other mothers to potentially avoid these experiences. And this is what led the two women to create Saving Our Sisters, which is a nonprofit organization created explicitly for the purpose of educating mothers who are considering infant adoption. And they are part of a nationwide network that is focused on what they call family preservation. This is their website, savingoursistersadoption.org. It says, Saving Our Sisters is dedicated to supporting all members of expectant families considering adoption. We focus on ensuring families do not apply a permanent solution to a temporary situation. She told me, quote, "We just started reaching out and talking to people, and lo and behold, these pregnant moms started finding us, and we started having lots of success in connecting to the adoption community that's out there today." Since that time, they've now grown. She told me they have volunteers in all 50 U.S. states, and they call their volunteers Sisters on the Ground, which are a family preservation focused individual, which will communicate with the mother and the family in need. So say a mom's like, "Look, I'm struggling right now financially. I don't want to go the abortion route. And I would like to keep my baby, but I'm not sure I can do it. I'm considering adoption. I found your organization. Can you tell me what I need to know?" And they will tell them the truth, the stories, the positive and the negative experiences, just the experiences as they are, as the truth from these mothers and from these families. The Sisters on the Ground share knowledge, advice, and resources related to the adoption industry. And specifically, this includes facts that won't be shared to them by groups like Bethany Christian Services. And again, in my previous reports, I've shown how Bethany Christian Services and these organizations, they partner with hospitals so that if a mother is considering adoption or just mentions that she might not want her baby in some capacity, Bethany Christian Services swoops in and says, "Hey, here's our paperwork. Get to know who we are, and we got families ready to go." And then that coercion, that subtle persuasion, and sometimes outright coercion comes into play, and mothers often end up regretting dealing with these organizations. Renee told me that due to the grassroots nature of their organization, resources are limiting for tackling the false information promoted by these adoption firms, and that they're competing against an industry with significant financial resources and pre-existing relationships with many hospitals. She told me, quote, "It all comes down to money. Ye who has the most money has the most face time. They can get in front of people more. They have the ability to travel and to hold seminars." But her team continues to do this work. They focus on direct action and educating families about their options for preserving the actual biological families whenever possible, and just giving them more information about the short and long-term impact of adoption separation, including the trauma to infants when they experience maternal separation. And she told me, quote, "What breakdown happened that made the mom feel like giving her baby to a stranger was the right thing?" And then this is another important point from Renee. She told me something similar that I heard from Catherine Joyce in my interview with her. Again, Catherine Joyce is the author of the book, The Child Catchers. She told me that many times these women who choose to go down this route are sometimes just struggling with making their next bills. Like if they had a little bit of financial help or support from family, friends, whatever it may be, they would not choose to put their babies up for adoption. But many of these people are individuals who do not have strong support networks, and they, in my belief, are preyed upon by these organizations and then taken advantage of. But Catherine Joyce is reporting, and what Renee told me is that sometimes they're dealing with women that just need a few $100s to make ends meet, to pay this bill or to get through the next couple months, and then they would be able to keep their baby. But because they're not, they face this choice, I think a very difficult choice, a choice that they often regret, and they choose to give their children up. So Renee told me, quote, "Back in 2015, when we were starting, I helped moms with $500 to keep their child and navigate their crisis, get through having their baby, get through the maternity leave, and successfully parent their kid." So I think that's an important point too, is that sometimes, I'm as an anarchist, as a libertarian, as a voluntarist, I don't really advocate for government welfare. I'm not saying, kick everybody off welfare and throw them out in the streets immediately, but I do wish we have a world where those programs weren't necessary and we could take care of ourselves more. So I'm not necessarily saying like the mom should be provided money, a welfare program by the government or something like that. I'm just saying the reality of the situation is not what many of us have been told, that sometimes these are just tough times. And, this is the crazy thing too. Any parent out there, I've seen friends and I've gone through my own childhood, and sometimes we didn't have a lot of extra money, but we made it. My parents, didn't choose to put me up for adoption or abort me, but there might have been times where money was tight and we had to go without certain things to make it through to the next paycheck or whatever, right? And just, it's so simple like that. Like a lot of people who choose to keep their babies end up struggling like that. But in these cases, these families, these mothers don't have the support systems. So that financial struggle becomes, I guess I'm going to give up my child for adoption. It's not what I want, but I feel like I'm backed into a corner. And then, of course, you add to that these coercive organizations, which are manipulating the women often, as my previous reporting shows. And it's just not a good situation. It's a bad situation. So and the other point that my brother over here in the comments is making is that this is actually a $1 billion industry around the world. the baby adoption, infant adoption industry, and then particularly as we're about to get into the Korean adoption industry. The fact of the matter is some people who want to adopt, they want an Asian baby. It's like a trendy type of thing. And so then that causes, of course, a desire, a demand for these babies, and somebody's going to fill it one way or the other. So I think it's very crazy, these types of situations. Let's continue on. Again, if you're just tuning in, we're covering my recent article for The Last American Vagabond, my third part in a series looking at the adoption industry and the truth of how these industries work. And now we're talking about the solutions, people who are actually working on this. So the next organization we're going to look at, let's talk about the woman behind the organizations. One of the women, her name is Janine Vance, and her twin sister, Jeanette. They were both adopted in 1972 from Seoul, South Korea to the U.S. And at 24 years old, after their adoptive mother passed away, her and her sister discovered that they were not U.S. citizens. They grew up their whole life just, not really knowing their history, being told that they were born in the U.S., that they were adopted, of course. And then in 2004, they traveled to Seoul, South Korea for the 50th anniversary gathering of overseas adoptees from Seoul. She told me, quote, there were about 450 Korean-born adoptees who traveled to Seoul to contemplate overseas adoption. And I think that's really interesting. It's the 50th anniversary, so 2004, so you're going back to 1954. What happened around that time? The Korean Wars, we're going to get into in a moment. And it was at this gathering that the twins discovered that there were Korean parents who were out there searching for their children. She said, quote, that came to us as a complete surprise because we had always been told that we were unwanted, that we were orphans, and that we were abandoned. That kind of triggered my investigation into how the children are obtained exactly. And the twins would soon discover that adoption agencies around the world have been caught claiming that children have been abandoned by their parents or that the birth parents have died. And as part of her investigation, she began to read the memoirs of the pioneers of the international adoption from South Korea. She said, quote, the pioneers were actually faith-based evangelicals who built the overseas child welfare system and actually have a huge impact and influence on the system, which has now exploded to overseas adoption all over the world. And so in 2011, the Vance twins started the Adoption, Truth, and Transparency Worldwide Information Network, which focuses on advocating for adoptees and providing resources for families who have experienced the trauma of adoptions. And through their website and their social media pages, Adoption Truth, they highlight the reality of the adoption industry, which most Americans are, and not even just Americans, but Koreans and people all around the world are painfully unaware of. And I think that's really a disturbing aspect of just the outright ignorance. Janine's told me that the Adoption Truth organization differs from other groups because they don't silence people who have had negative experiences with adoption. So this is one of the common things I've been told is that if you, let's say you have dealt with adoption, you get approached by Bethany Christian Services, you choose to relinquish your rights, and you go to them because you're having trauma, you're having, just mental health issues dealing with the whole thing, and you were told they were going to be there, they were going to make therapy available to you, but it all ends up being bullshit. They totally just turn their backs on you. In fact, as I reported in part 2, some of the mothers were told, you can't say that. Don't tell the adoptee, the parents that took your baby, don't tell them you're miserable. Don't tell them you're depressed. They're not allowed to know that. And, they want to suppress the truth about this because this is $1 billion industry. So most of the other organizations that are adoption advocacy groups are people that don't want to hear the negative side of things. They're only there to, promote the positive aspects of it. And Janine was even telling me there's kind of this like twisted cycle, I guess, where in some cases the adoption agencies like expect the adoptees to come full circle and then adopt children themselves, which is sort of like a tacit endorsement of it. I mean, an outright endorsement of adoption by saying, yeah, I was adopted. Now I'm going to go adopt more babies myself because I know it's such a great thing. But that's not always the truth, of course. Janine said that these other groups put a priority, or that her group puts a priority on the voices of families who've been separated by adoption and adopted people as adults who want to talk about the truths relating to the adoption industry without being shamed. She told me, quote, the people who've been influenced by these adoption agencies, they have these knee-jerk reactions to us that we are anti-abortion when really we are questioning the way that children are obtained for adoption. Anti-adoption. And so she's saying they're not anti-adoption, they're just questioning the way that children are obtained for adoption. Now, of course, Janine and her sister's story is related to the Korean adoption industry, and this takes us from my focus on Bethany Christian Services, which mainly operates in the U.S. and a few other countries. Now we're starting to look more broadly about this, and I do believe I will have future articles in this series where we look at the adoption industry as it relates to Africa, to India. And then back here in the I'm not in the US, but back in the US, you can look at the adoption industry as it relates to Native American people, which is my ancestry, and Native American tribes and the reservation system. A lot of theft of children that took place in those communities as well. This is not an unusual situation we're describing. So Janine told me that she can trace the history of adoption back to the Catholic Church in Europe in 1618 and then in the Americas in 1850s. She says then in the 1950s, after the Korean War ended, the evangelicals and the missionaries began coming to Korea and started the demand for children. From there, this Korean model of adoption was seen as the standard model for overseas adoption. And she told me, quote, the reason why it has that reputation is because everything became legalized. They created adoption laws that made it legal to do what a lot of adoptees believe is child trafficking. So that standard becomes codified, and then from there, it's exported to South America, Africa, India, and other parts of the developing world. And in recent years, though, the Korean adoption industry is actually starting to hit the mainstream news, including a focus on the Holt adoption firm, which was responsible for the Vance twins adoptions. And I'll just open these up real quick. I found, numerous reports. Thankfully, this is getting more information out there. This is NPR via Associated Press in 2023, South Korean inquiry to look into more foreign adoptions with suspect origins. This is a video from Australian news, because there are Australian South Koreans, of course, that were adopted out. It says fake orphans and stolen babies, investigating South Korea's sham adoptions. Like, this is, you might not have heard about this, guys, but this is a growing problem. And in 2023, Janine and her sister sent a special request to the Korean government's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, asking it to end overseas adoption. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2005 to investigate various atrocities in Korean history, including after the Korean War. And the women and other organizations, there's about a dozen or more organizations involved, are calling on the Korean government to finally end overseas adoption 70 years after the Korean War ended. And it says, quote, to refrain from ratifying the Hague Adoption Convention, which was created and monitored by the adoption lobby itself to legitimize child trafficking. And that sounds like something else to look into, the Hague Adoption Convention. They said that they sent their files to the commission to investigate their adoption, as well as hundreds of other Korean-born adoptees who were sent to the U.S. and Europe. The document was supported by Saving Our Sisters, the National Association of Adoptees and Parents, Adoptees with Guatemalan Roots, the Family Preservation Project, Adoptees Rights Australia Incorporated, and dozens of other family preservation adoptee advocate organizations. And they're looking for more people to sign on. Janine and her sister also organized the Adoption Trafficking Awareness Symposium, which brings together adoptees and advocates. And she said specifically they refuse to take money from big donors who are associated with the major adoption firms. They also run adoptionhistory.org, which she said is her effort to get the perspectives of adopted people out into the mainstream. And she says the website is focused on adding educational resources on the adoption crisis, which are devoid of faith-based industry and advertising campaigns and marketing ploys, which, quote, deceptively hail faith-based agencies as saviors and also proclaim that they speak for and work for God. And one thing that Janine told me that we'll end here with is she said, quote, one of the things I would ask for the public is don't vilify us or persecute us and say that we're anti-adoption. In the adoption world, that is equal to being anti-Jesus, anti-Christian, anti-religion. Really, what we're doing is we're on the side of families and natural human rights and reuniting communities. So that is my third article in my series about the adoption industry. It's titled Meet the Organizations, Exposing the Truth About Adoption and Supporting Families in Need. And I'll tell you guys this, if you go to thelastAmericanVagabond.com, you check on the browser, there's a tab that says TLAV Team. You scroll down to my name, Derrick Broze, and now you'll see a landing page, Bethany Christian Services and the Adoption Industrial Complex is what we're calling this series. And that will link you to all three of these articles. And if you're listening to this later, the show notes are at theconsciousresistance.com. But yeah, you can go there on TLAV. I'll make sure to include this after we're done here. All three of my parts are there. You can read them. You can see them. You can also go to theconsciousresistance.com and find my video breakdowns of each of those articles. You can find my full interview with Renee of Saving Our Sisters, because obviously in that article, I just quoted a few pieces from there. But if you want to listen to the full interview, it's titled How Saving Our Sisters Supports Families Impacted by the Adoption Industry. That was just released yesterday. And then my interview with Janine titled Exposing the Adoption Truth and Supporting Those in Need. Both of those can be found over at theconsciousresistance.com, and I'll be adding an adoption category to the website very soon so we can make it easier for you guys to find that. So what do you think about it? Is this, am I, barking up the wrong tree? Is there nothing to see here? Adoption's all good, and Derrick, you're just crazy. This is better than them being aborted. What are your thoughts?
Since 2012, the Conscious Resistance Network has been an independent media organization focused on empowering individuals through education, philosophy, health, and community organizing. We work to create a world where corporate and state power do not rule over the lives of free human beings. Our motto is leading by example and helping others in their pursuit of freedom. Visit theconsciousresistance.com to find our articles, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, books, and more. Remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.